So again, welcome to this presentation. Again, my name is Jocelyn, and we are joining you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So it's located right on northeastern part of this lovely country. Both Amanda and I and Nate all work in this building right on the edge of downtown Pittsburgh. This building is filled with all different histories from Pittsburgh, but today we will be talking about Western Pennsylvania and how the Great Migration really affected and shaped this area. Before we get started with the presentation, I always like to check in what comes to mind when you think and talk about the Great Migration. So go ahead and use that chat box to share any ideas that come to your mind.
We have someone saying people moving states, a great cultural movement. People are saying things like butterflies and birds that also migrate.
Yeah, so those are all really great things. You get the idea of migration. It's about something moving. In this case, you're talking about these people moving from different states up to these northern states. And I like whoever said that there was this movement of culture. So these people aren't just moving themselves, they're also bringing this rich culture with them. So these are just some vocabulary words that we're going to be using throughout this presentation that I just want to go over before we get started, just to make sure everyone kind of understands what we're going to be talking about. So we have Jim Crow laws, and those were the laws that legally separated Black people from white people, particularly in southern states. Then we have that term migrant, and that is a person who moves from one place to another, especially in order to find work or better living conditions. And segregation, so that's keeping people separated by race in schools, housing, public spaces, just in public in general. Just want to check in that everyone's understanding those terms. Were there any?
Yeah, we just have some more comments coming through in the chat about people moving for specific reasons, and they're starting to mention things about someone from Whittier Elementary has said, it makes me think if people are being brave and strong because they need to work hard to get to new places, so they're still connecting with that. What are they thinking about the Great Migration?
Yeah, so it's great you're making those connections and not just saying it's about them moving, it's about like the attitude they're having when they have to make this really tough decision. So before we get into the Western Pennsylvania story, we have to kind of set the stage and talk about what happened leading up to this mass movement of people. So there are a few events that happened in our nation, specifically affecting the South, that really set the stage for this movement of African Americans from southern states to these northern industrial cities. So in 1863, there was the Emancipation Proclamation that takes effect. And the Emancipation Proclamation was something that freed all of those that were once enslaved in Confederate states. So those were the people that were fighting against the Union or the United States. Then in 1865, we finally have the end of the Civil War. So the South conceded or surrendered and said, we will not take arms up against the North or the United States again. And then we have this long period from 1865 to 1877 called Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is a really difficult period to talk about because it had so many parts to it. but its main focus was trying to have the South rejoin the Union. So there were three main goals to it, and that was to bring the Union back together, to really change this Southern society, so really changing what they believed in their cultural norms, so mostly surrounding enslavement, and then creating laws that gave rights to those people that were once enslaved. So this all ends in 1877 when the federal troops that were really watching over the southern states left. And at this time in United States history, the focus really shifted from being focused on making the Union one again to issues that surrounded economics. So looking at how the United States is doing financially. So the period after that, from 1890 to 1910, we had these southern states rewriting their state constitutions. So this basically means that each state has their own rules that they really follow. And what they did is by rewriting these rules, they were able to start excluding people that were once enslaved. So they made it legal to live a separate society, basically live in a separate society than these African Americans that were once enslaved. And then at 1916, after all of this has happened, we really start to see this huge movement of African Americans from southern states to northern states and cities. That was a lot of information just in this one slide. Were there any questions about that before I move on?
No, I think so far people are just taking it all in. We have had a little more going on in the chat just about the Great Migration in general, but we're kind of handling it in there. So yeah, I think you're good.
Great, perfect. So in the last slide, you saw that we really marked the Great Migration as starting in 1916. In reality, it was much more drawn out, but during the 1910s, 1916, 1915 is really when the flood of people started really moving to the northern states. So the Great Migration was a large movement of Black Southerners to northern cities. So this was during the Jim Crow era, so when all those laws that were making segregation legal were happening. So the South was filled with this racism and prejudice, and legally, although African Americans were free, they were still living in conditions that were similar to when they were enslaved. People saw that these northern cities really provided them an opportunity at a better life, so they moved to these larger industrial cities and spaces to pursue that. And one of those places that they decided to settle was Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh specifically. So when we look at this image, what do you see and what does this make you think about? And again, go ahead and drop any answers that you have in that chat so Amanda or Nate can share out.
Okay, we have someone saying family. I see family.
So you can see that this is a family unit.
Someone says they think it looks like they are in a bus.
So it looks like they're in some type of transportation vehicle, similar to a bus.
Someone thought it might be a train.
That is what it is. It's a train. So we get that idea of movement.
We have someone saying it looks like they might be passing a power plant.
Yeah, and you're saying that because of these smokestacks in the back, right?
And Jocelyn, we also have some people mentioning what's on the table in front of these people. So we have someone saying it looks like a cookout. We have some people saying it looks like they're eating at a picnic.
Yeah, so we have you see them traveling on this train, but you also see this picnic basket filled with food that they might be eating on their way. You are making really good observations that all add to the story. So this image is called They Arrive in Pittsburgh, one of the great industrial centers of the North, in large numbers. So this is a series of paintings that were done by someone named Jacob Barnes, and he did a whole series about the Great Migration. And this specific scene is showing them arriving in Pittsburgh. So you see those smokestacks in the back. So Pittsburgh was known as an industrial city with steel production and coal mining surrounding it, being very important to our culture and economy. So how a lot of people made money here. And you also, some of you said that this looks like a family unit. And you see these people pointing at what they're seeing out of the window. So it looks like they're seeing it for the first time. And then you also see in this gentleman's face over here, you can see him smiling. So it is something that they're happy about. And then you also mentioned this basket down here. So the reason we see that food basket is because a lot of times when these people were traveling to the north, they didn't know if they were going to be able to buy food on the train, if they were going to be able to, when they had stops along the way, if they were going to be able to get off the train and have people service them, because during this time in the South, there was still that segregation. So by packing these large food baskets, they could ensure that they had enough food for their journey. And it was also a reminder of where they were coming from. So a lot of times when people cook, it reminds them of home. So by having this, it is like bringing a part of themselves with them and kind of comforts them on their journey. So again, that food basket plays a really important role because when they're in the South, they still have these segregation laws. So separating colored people from the white majority of people. And you still see some of in these images, you see what that would look like and how in your face it would be, from signs that you clearly see in the windows, stopping other people from entering, to little partitions on the bus that really stop you from being able to move freely throughout a space. So we have this question, why did Black people leave the South? So we have poverty being a real issue, racial oppression, lack of safety, flooding, boll weevil infestation, and poor harvest. So all of these things together really created an environment that wasn't really a good place to live. So you had these laws that were causing segregation and making racial oppression legal. And on top of that, the jobs that they were having were often suffering from these crop failures and poor harvests that were affecting the area at the time. So why did Blacks come to Pittsburgh? Black people come to Pittsburgh. They came for jobs. There was more safety, so there wasn't these public displays of violence against African Americans. And there was also an existing community in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania at that time. And we also have this last thing that was noted down here, that was a labor shortage. So while all of this was happening, there was another major event in US history happening, that was World War I. So in the northern cities, a lot of the people that were working in these large factories were being drafted. So they were having to leave their job, and that empty job provided opportunities for African Americans to come in and fill them. So as we move throughout time, we see the African American population in Pittsburgh steadily increasing. From 1910 to 1940, it increases from 37,000 all the way up to 123,000. And then if we look at the second part of the Great Migration, it's increasing all the way up to 172,000. So the first one was a pretty sharp increase, and then once you get to the second one, it's a little slower. But that is basically setting the scene of the Great Migration and how these different people are moving to these northern cities. And from here, I'm going to pass it on to Amanda. If there are any questions while we're switching our screen, go ahead and read those out for us, Nate.
While you're in your screen share, Jocelyn, and I'm going to start mine in a second here, there were some really, really great comments in the chat about how people might have been leaving the situation that they were in the South and coming to the North and facing additional problems or different problems. And I really, really appreciate people pointing that out. That's kind of what we're going to start talking about in a second here. The different things that were going on in the North that might be different problems to the South, but still problems. And so we're going to address some of that out loud here. And we've got some things to show you, but really great connections that people are making in the chat there.
So all I did was just talk about the setting of the scene and what was really happening in the South. Coming to the North, it was a whole different story, and it really wasn't what people imagined it to be, but I'll let you uncover that story, Amanda. I don't want to ruin it for everyone.
Yes, and Nate's been answering a few things in the chat and the Q&A there as well, and Jocelyn's going to take over some of what I was doing in there, and now I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit more about some more specific stories of what it's like on this end of the Great Migration up here in Pittsburgh. So let me just get that up here. Okay, and Jocelyn, just let me know if that looks right.
Yep, looks good.
Cool. Okay. So in talking about the experience here in Pittsburgh for people who left the South, and maybe what that journey was like for people, we always like to talk about it through the stories of a person whose life we know about. So as historians, we like to have these sources and this real information to share. And one person that we have some information from is a lady whose name was Lillian Allen. And Lillian Allen was born in 1909 in Alabama. She came here to Pittsburgh when she was very young. She was 4 years old. And unfortunately, her mother died, and she came to Pittsburgh to live with her aunt. And so while she was here, she went to school for a little bit. She ended up going back to the South, and then she got married when she was 17 years old and came back to Pittsburgh. And she had all different kinds of jobs here. She lived a very long life here. Lillian Allen lived to be 107 years old. And towards the end of her life, a lot of people were interviewing her and talking with her because it's so unusual for a person to live that long of a life. And the lifespan that she had is really, really interesting. So she saw what life was like for African-American people all the way from the Jim Crow laws up until Obama becoming president, having a Black president. And she was so proud of all of those achievements. And so I want to flip to my next slide here and show you a picture of Lillian Allen when she was older. And I'm going to play you a clip of her voice, of her telling the story of why people first started to come here to Pittsburgh. And the words that you'll see on the side here are a rough transcription, a sort of write-up of what she is saying in case you can't quite make it out. But I'm hoping that this sound will work. So let me know if it doesn't, but here we go. We're going to hear from Miss Lillian.
So anyway, well, my mom, that was during the First World War. And the reason he came, my uncle, his uncle by marriage, he came because they drafted all of the white people, foreign people, everybody, they drafted everybody. And when they turned around, they didn't have anybody to do any work. So they went down through the South. And of course, you know, we already had the civil action had gone through, you know, there were no more slaves. And anybody who wanted to come to the North could. So everybody that couldn't come otherwise, they let them come. And
all right. So there's just a little clip of Lillian telling her story. This is what we call an oral history. So someone sat down and interviewed Miss Lillian about her life and recorded it all so that we could hear it in her own voice. And I just think that's so special. She talks all about the different things that she went through coming here to Pittsburgh, the different things that she faced and the people around her were facing here in the city. I encourage you to look up her story too, because she's just such an interesting person. She's very funny. She tells lots of jokes in her oral history, and just a really lovely lady. So her story gives us a little bit of a clue there that Jocelyn talked about, this idea that people started coming here because everybody, all of the white people and the people who had come here from other countries and became citizens got drafted into the First World War. And that gave Black people an opportunity to find a way into those types of work here in places like Pittsburgh. So I'm going to move on now and talk about some of the things that people faced when they came here to Pittsburgh, some of the problems that they maybe came across. Some of that information comes from people like Lillian Allen telling their story, and some of it comes from sources that we have at the History Center in our archives. Before I move on from there, was there anything about Miss Lillian that we should go over before I move on?
Go ahead, Nate.
Would you be able to remind us when she passed away and how old she was approximately whenever we recorded her story?
She was 107 years old, and I can't do the math out loud in my head while I'm talking. But it wasn't very long ago that she died. I want to say maybe 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. Okay. I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about some of the issues that people faced when they were coming here to Pittsburgh. Now, this is a source that we have in our archives at the History Center. This is a write-up, like a typed document of a study that was done of students who were new to Pittsburgh Public Schools that were in the Hill District, so that's a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, in the fall of 1927. So the first little bit of school in 1927, people did a study of all of the students who were new to the schools in the Hill District to try to figure out where people were coming from. Now, a little thing about the Hill District, if you're not familiar with the city, the Hill District is this neighborhood right here in the middle of almost right near downtown Pittsburgh. So this is all downtown where our big tall buildings are. The History Center Museum in the Strip District, where we all work, is right around here. And then this is a great big hill that goes up here into the middle of the city. And the Hill District is a really, really important neighborhood to the history of Pittsburgh. Lots and lots of different groups of people came through the Hill District as they were arriving in Pittsburgh. So when people were coming from Europe, that's often a place where they first went to live and find work. And then they would move on to another part of the city. And that's the same thing that happens when these African-American migrants are coming up from the South. The Hill District is one of the first neighborhoods that they can find a house in and maybe start to find some work in. Of course, it's not the only neighborhood where that happened, but it is a really, really important neighborhood when we talk about these migrants coming up to Pittsburgh. And so when people came to Pittsburgh and they settled in the Hill District, that survey of all of those students went through all of these different students who were new to the schools in the Hill District and asked them where they came from, like what state did they come to Pittsburgh from. And so you'll notice here, there are lots of students from Alabama, lots of students from Georgia, lots from South Carolina and Virginia, and also a fair number from West Virginia. And so in 1927, that means that these schools had brand new students from all these different states, all coming here into the Hill District with their families to go to school. So that means not only were these maybe Black men coming up on their own to find jobs in the steel mills, but some were also coming up as a family unit and settling here in the city. So that gives us an idea of the big places that lots of people are coming from. So people talk a lot about migrants from Georgia living here in Pittsburgh, and that gives us an indication there that at least in 1927, there were a lot of them. Now, when they came here into Pittsburgh, I said they faced some problems. One of the problems that they faced, according to this report, is housing. And this is something that people had faced before them, and you know, still sometimes a problem. But the Hill District in the 1920s was a really crowded part of the city. So this says here, like multiple families might be crowded into these 2, 3, and 4 room houses, and they're paying a lot of money for that. So the people who own the houses know that people need housing, and so they know they can charge a lot of money for their house, to rent their house out. And the people who are coming into the city really just need to find somewhere to live, and it might not be an ideal place. At least they can kind of settle in and see what they can do from there. So when people first come into Pittsburgh, some of the housing is really hard for them. And here are some pictures that we found of some of these houses. Now, this house, it just looks a little bit sort of rough around the edges, right? Some of the photographs of the insides of these houses are really, really, it's really tough to look at the conditions that people were having to live in when they moved here. So you can see things are just a little bit rough around the edges, but inside these houses would have been worse because they were already old by the time the Great Migration was happening. Lots of people had already lived in these houses before the migrants came up to Pittsburgh. So they're living in a part of the city where the houses are a little bit rough. The houses, especially early in the Great Migration, might not have had indoor plumbing. And so I'm sure you can figure out what this is here. This is an outhouse. And it's hard to imagine houses in the city having outhouses, but they absolutely did. And a lot of these houses in the Hill District had not had bathrooms or sinks installed inside the house. So people had to go outside to use the bathroom, and they also had to go outside to get water. And so all of those things are not great. And it's especially a problem because when people lived in the South, they might have been maybe sharecroppers or something. They had lots of land, and their houses might not have been perfect, but they had space. And when they come here to Pittsburgh, they're often crowded, a whole family maybe in one room. And that means that disease can spread very quickly. It's just an uncomfortable way to live. And the reason for that is that the Hill District was a neighborhood where Black people felt maybe comfortable living because they didn't have to worry about trying to move into a white neighborhood. And that is something that we see throughout this whole story. Black people are made to live in one particular part of the city or a few particular parts of the city, and they aren't free to just move around wherever they want to. Another problem that they faced a lot was discrimination in work and employment. And so the Urban League is an organization that still exists, but it was working here in Pittsburgh in the 1920s to try to help people settle into Pittsburgh and connect them with support that they might need here in the city. And so they did this study, this sort of report on what was going on in terms of work, particularly in things like the steel mills. Now, when people were coming here to Pittsburgh to work in these industrial places, this is sort of what it would have looked like. So this picture on the right here is a picture of Hazelwood, another neighborhood here in Pittsburgh. You can see this big steel mill, all these houses sort of tucked up in the hills. And for people who are used to living out in the countryside in the South, especially people who were working as farmers or sharecroppers, this is a really, really different environment. It would have been loud because of all of that machinery and the steel mills churning out smoke, so it's smoky. People are really crowded in together, and the people who are coming here to Pittsburgh just aren't used to that way of life. That's not to say they had never been to a city before or anything like that. A lot of people maybe worked part of the year out in the fields and part of the year in a southern city. But southern cities are very different to what Pittsburgh is like at this time. And so the environment is very different to them. They're not used to this kind of work. So if you're used to working in the fields, working in a steel mill is very different. So this picture here on the left is a picture of the inside of a steel mill, the open sort of furnace where they are heating up all of the ingredients to make steel. You can see a person sort of looking down in there, but you can almost see the heat in this picture, right? You see all these sort of the steam and smoke kind of coming off of this. And steel mills were often a dangerous environment and a chaotic environment, very loud and very noisy. And so very, very different for the people who were coming up here. And that meant that they sometimes had problems when they were trying to get these jobs. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just wanted to sort of summarize that when they were coming here and places, organizations like the Urban League were trying to help them, they were trying to get the employers, so the people who run the steel mills, to understand the problem that some of these workers were having. And so they were trying to get the employers to understand that a lot of these people are not used to this kind of work, and they need support from other people around them. So it might be better for these new migrants to have someone who is also a Black worker who has already gone through all of this to sort of help the newcomers as they're coming into work at a steel mill. They are also trying to encourage these workplaces to think about housing and try to find a way to provide housing for some of the people who are working in the steel mills. Because, you know, we saw those pictures of the houses in the Hill District, and it really helps the workers to have more suitable housing for their families. They're also trying to encourage people not to discriminate against workers by race. So a lot of times what these migrant workers or migrants would find when they came to Pittsburgh, Black people coming into the city would find that when they were working in a steel mill, the white workers around them might be working about the same level, like they might be working just as hard, doing the same kind of job, but the white workers would get promoted or they would get a raise where the Black workers would not. And obviously that is very frustrating for them and very unfair. And so the Urban League and places like that were trying to encourage those places to stop doing that, because it would mean that they would have better workers overall if everyone was treated fairly. And so there's lots of organizations trying to help with this, not only in Pittsburgh, but all over the country. The Urban League is all over the United States. But they're trying to do what they can to sort of help and make an impact. Any questions we should address there before I move on a little bit here?
You know, I had an interesting one asked about that building in the Hill District and why it was built crooked.
This one here?
Yeah.
I'm assuming they mean that one. Yeah, that is a good question. I don't think it was built crooked.
Yeah, so I think it was because of Pittsburgh being so hilly. So if it was built on a hill, oftentimes the buildings look crooked because they had to level it out.
Yes. Or it was built on a hill and started to kind of slide a little bit over time. Yeah. Yes. Anything else?
And then I also had another question about, were there protests? And when I asked for like a clarification, they were like, were there protests in the South about these people living? And I guess I didn't touch on that much, but there were, because these African Americans were the source of this hard, cheap labor. So as more and more people were deciding to leave, they were deserting these towns and these jobs. And the people down there were like, wait, we wanted some of you to leave, but not all of you. Like, who's going to do this work? So a lot of times these southern states and cities would often kind of want them back. And I think you'll go into that a little bit later. But
yes,
it's a little foreshadowing, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, so the Southerners did not like losing their entire labor force. All their workers were trying to go north, and they didn't like that at all. Yeah, okay, I'm going to move on here and talk about another part of Western Pennsylvania. So we are, obviously the History Center is in Pittsburgh, but we talk about the whole of Western Pennsylvania. And there's another city that had similar kind of issues to what Pittsburgh had, but it got a little more out of control there. And that city is Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is east of the city, sort of up in the mountains. You can see here what the city looks like. And this here gives you a sense of what was kind of going on there. They had a big steel industry there too. And during the Great Migration, a lot of Black people also moved to Johnstown. Not as many as Pittsburgh. It was a much smaller place than Pittsburgh, but their Black population tripled over 10 years from 1910 to 1920. And that's a big change for a small city like Johnstown. They also had a lot of Mexican workers coming to Johnstown. And they had a little bit of a problem in that some of the white residents were not very happy about that change. And then one day something really, really awful happened where there was a fight between a Black person and some other people. And it turned into a really, really big problem that led to many people being injured, but also people being killed. And some of those people who were killed were police. And this kicked off a huge problem in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. In 1923 is when this happened. And so what happened is that the mayor of Johnstown, after this incident, because the problem was started by a Black person, the mayor, decided to make all of the Black people in Johnstown who had not been there for more than 7 years leave the town. And so he put out this order that said, if you are a Black person and you are living in Johnstown and you have not been here for more than 7 years, then you need to leave. And it was really shocking to not only the people of Johnstown, but people from all over start writing to this mayor and saying, what are you doing? And the mayor writes back, and this is a newspaper article from the time. It says he doesn't care what New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, or any of the other cities' newspapers think of his action, ordering all of these people to leave. They just need to go. And so nothing like that really happens here in Pittsburgh, but that doesn't mean it's not happening in the cities sort of around Pittsburgh. Of course, there might have been even white people living in Johnstown who disagreed with this. And the mayor seems to have been a little bit of a character, but that is something that really happened. He tried to kick all of these people out of his town. And so it doesn't sound unlike something that might have happened in the South, but it was actually happening up here in Pennsylvania. And what ends up happening with that is that a lot of cities in the South start writing to newspapers in the North saying, oh, I've seen what happened in Johnstown. We don't do that down here in the South. So those workers can come back and get jobs in our cotton farms anytime they want to. They can come right back, and we will never kick them out of a town like they did in Johnstown. And so it just starts this whole conversation about, where are people welcome? Where are they not welcome? What can make someone that unwelcome, like what happened in Johnstown? And it's something that not a lot of people know about. Someone wrote a book about it about 2 years ago now. A really, really shocking story to hear from Pennsylvania, but it did happen. It's a really, really terrible part of history, but I think something that people should be aware of. Any questions there before I move on? I know we're getting close to time here. I just want to show these last images.
Someone asked about racism in Pittsburgh, and I'm sure that'll come up in this next little section, but I wanted to publicly acknowledge that was a question that we had in the Q&A section.
Yes, so absolutely there was racism here in Pittsburgh. So that housing discrimination, the fact that people are being made to live in those unsuitable houses, that is an exact example of this racism. People couldn't just go live wherever they wanted to in Pittsburgh because Black people were not welcome in all neighborhoods. And there were even laws preventing, in some places, people from moving into certain neighborhoods, or banks wouldn't give people money to move into certain neighborhoods. You all may have heard of redlining is the word that they use for that, where Black people were not allowed to live in neighborhoods that did not already have Black people living in them. And so it's things like that in Pittsburgh. In that same year, 1923, where that incident happened in Johnstown, there was actually a KKK rally in Carnegie, PA, which is just a little bit outside the city, but not far. And so it definitely was here, and it definitely was happening, unfortunately. And I think what we're going to talk about next is how people, despite all of that, right, despite all of the stuff that is going on, and that housing discrimination and discrimination in work and their schools not being as good as maybe the schools in white neighborhoods, people still find a way in Pittsburgh to thrive and to do really, really good things and to support one another. And so I'm going to go ahead into this next slide here that talks about a really important part of Pittsburgh's history as it relates to the Great Migration. but a little bit more of a positive story too. So there was a newspaper that was operating here in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Courier. And this newspaper started in 1910 and started off very small, but it grew and grew and grew. And it was a Black-owned newspaper. And all of the people who were writing for the newspaper were Black, and they were covering these issues that were related to the Black communities here in Pittsburgh, but also around the country. So it starts off being quite local, but it grows and grows until this newspaper is being made in Pittsburgh, but sold and delivered all over the country as one of the strongest and most important Black newspapers in the United States. You may have heard of the Chicago Defender. That's another one. The Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier become sort of the biggest Black newspapers in the country. Now, there was a newspaper in this area that covered a little bit of African-American news. The Pittsburgh Press had a separate section of its newspaper that talked about issues related to the Black communities here. But other than that, no newspapers were really covering the things that were going on in the Black community until the Pittsburgh Courier sort of picked up on that. So they would send journalists down to the South to write about what they were experiencing. They would talk about all the different goings on here in Pittsburgh, and especially sort of later in the Great Migration, so sort of during World War II and beyond, it becomes a very, very popular newspaper. And so one of the people who worked for that newspaper was this gentleman here. His name was Teenie Harris, and he was a photographer for the Courier. So he was going around and taking all of the pictures that were being included in that newspaper. And so he was actually born here in Pittsburgh, but he was born in 1908, and his parents owned a boarding house in the Hill District. And so that's a place where lots of different migrants were coming and maybe staying for a little while before they found somewhere to live. So Teenie Harris and his family really watched the Great Migration happen from the perspective of Pittsburgh. So they were here the whole time and saw this Black community growing and growing and growing. And so he was a person who would take pictures for the newspaper, but also just because he liked to take pictures. And he's a really, really important source of information for us as historians, because without his pictures, there's so much we wouldn't know about that went on in Pittsburgh's Black communities, because this stuff wasn't written down and documented, but we have Teenie Harris's images to tell us about them. So he took a lot of pictures in the Hill District because that continued to be a predominantly Black neighborhood. His pictures are part of the Carnegie Museum of Art's collection. So they don't live at the History Center, they live at the Carnegie Museum of Art. They have lots of great exhibits about his work all the time, and they're doing really important research on them. So you can check those out at the Carnegie, but here's a few that you can see. And I like this image because this is Duke Ellington, who's a famous jazz musician. And that gives us a hint about what's going on in the Hill District in sort of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, which is that lots and lots of people are bringing their culture to Pittsburgh. And jazz music is one of those parts of culture that comes here. You may have heard of the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was where lots of different writers and musicians and all different kinds of people from the Black community are starting to become popular, not only amongst Black people, but amongst everyone. And that's not just happening in Harlem in New York City, that happens here in Pittsburgh and all across the country too. And so Pittsburgh has the Hill District as the sort of center of this. Lots of wonderful jazz musicians there. You may have heard of August Wilson, who was writing plays about that neighborhood and about the Black experience in Pittsburgh. So lots and lots of cultural activity going on there. I wonder if we notice anything about the people in this picture here. Someone wants to say in the chat very quickly. Okay, let's see.
We have some people saying that they're all men.
Are all men? I don't see any ladies in that picture at all, actually. That's kind of unusual. But yeah, this particular photo has just men.
And they see some white people as well as Black people.
Yeah, so you'll notice this crowd is pretty mixed. And I think that's an important thing to notice about these jazz clubs in the Hill District. It wasn't just Black people going to hear other Black people play music. It was very mixed. And so it was one part of Pittsburgh's history in a neighborhood where lots and lots of people are coming together to sort of celebrate. these jazz musicians who are traveling through, coming from Pittsburgh, but also traveling through Pittsburgh to play their music here. And so that particular person is Duke Ellington, but you may have also heard of someone like Mary Lou Williams, was a jazz piano player. She came from Pittsburgh and played a lot here in the Hill District, but also all over the world. All different kinds of jazz musicians here. So really important part of our story. And I'm going to stop there because I'm mindful of our time here. I know I've gone over a couple minutes already. There's so much that we could talk about when we talk about the Great Migration in Pittsburgh. We just picked a few little stories for you and a few little windows into what was going on here in Pittsburgh. You will see in the chat that Jocelyn has put the link to a Kahoot quiz that you can take that goes over some of this to see what you've learned today. You'll see the Kahoot link and the passcode there. Those are open until March 1st. And so we've done a Kahoot quiz for each of these presentations. This is our third one. And after March 1st, we will let teachers know how everybody did and see who maybe won or did super well on those Kahoot quizzes. So you have until March 1st to do that. If you want to do it now, you're more than welcome to. It's up to you. I'm going to stop my screen share here so I can see. And if there's any last questions before we wrap up that we didn't cover, I'm happy to do so.
I'm not seeing much, just someone agreeing with the Johnstown thing, how it was a little confusing that because one person, the mayor, would do something like that.
Yes, it is. And that's what a lot of those Southern people who are writing to say, we don't do this in the South, are kind of pointing out, like, and they're saying like, you should never punish the group of people for the actions of one person. And yeah, it is just really hard to understand why he would do something like that, but it happened.
Yeah, other than that, it's just a few offhand questions, but nothing, no big ideas.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us, especially since we had to move the time and everything, and it was a little bit of a mess this morning. I hope you all are safe and sound out there. And thanks to Jocelyn, and thanks to Nate for helping out in the chat. And yeah, great job, everyone. I hope you can join us again sometime soon.